The unforeseen invasion. Layla's fingers gripped the door frame, her breath shallow as the reality of the situation began to settle in. The officer's presence in her home, their cold eyes and harsh words, felt like an assault on her very sense of safety. But she didn't have the luxury of time to process it. Her heart raced as they stormed into her apartment without waiting for any further invitation. She could feel the tension in the air, thick with a dangerous energy. The three men moved swiftly, their feet echoing in the small apartment. One of them, the tallest of the group, moved with a deliberate air, scanning the space as though it were a criminal's den. His cold eyes lingered on her for a moment, an unsettling gleam hidden behind a mask of authority. His uniform was crisp, perfectly pressed, but his presence felt wrong. He wasn't just a man in uniform, he was a man who held power, and that power, Layla realized, was being used to violate her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and clipped, "we have a warrant to search your premises." He didn't wait for her response before continuing, his tone becoming sharp, "We believe you're harboring someone illegally. Step aside. We're conducting a search." Layla swallowed, trying to control the rising panic that threatened to take hold of her. She had seen plenty of police officers during her life, but none had ever treated her like this. She wasn't in the wrong, there was no one hiding in her apartment, no illegal activity she was involved in, but the way they spoke to her, like she had no right to question them, felt dehumanizing. "I need to see the warrant," Layla replied, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. The officer's eyes flashed with something she couldn't quite place, a hint of annoyance, perhaps. But he didn't respond. Instead, the two other men had already started searching. They were methodical in their approach, moving from room to room with little regard for the sanctity of her space. One of them, with a rough and weathered face, was already rummaging through her kitchen drawers, tossing aside utensils as if they were nothing but irrelevant debris. The other officer, shorter but no less imposing, was tearing through the small stack of books on her coffee table. Layla wanted to stop them, to demand answers, but she couldn't. The authority they exuded was suffocating. She felt trapped, a helpless observer of the destruction unfolding around her. The weight of their intrusion pressed down on her, a suffocating reminder that her home was no longer a sanctuary, but a place where her privacy could be torn apart at will. The sound of her precious belongings being overturned, discarded, and ruined filled her ears. A delicate vase her grandmother had passed down to her shattered on the floor, its pieces scattered in sharp shards. Layla winced at the sound, but the officers didn't even flinch. Her eyes followed them, desperate to make sense of this madness, but all she could focus on was the growing panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She was being violated in the very place she should have felt safest, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The tall officer, who had remained silent up until this point, turned toward her with a glint of something almost predatory in his eyes. There was a sick smile on his face, a cruel twist to his lips. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively recoiled, pressing her back against the wall. Her throat went dry, and she had to swallow hard to keep her voice from trembling. "We need to search you now, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice low, but laced with an unmistakable menace. Layla's body went rigid. Her heart skipped a beat as the full implication of his words crashed over her. She had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable. Her instincts screamed at her to fight, to resist, but she didn't know how. These men were in her home. They had the authority. Or so they believed. "No," she said, the word coming out more forcefully than she had anticipated. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. "You can't do this without cause." The officer sneered at her. "Do you really think it matters what you want?" His voice dripped with disdain. "We're above you, Miss Johnson. You'll do as we say." His words stung, not just because of the cruelty behind them, but because of the unsettling truth they carried. Layla was nothing more than a pawn to these men. And they enjoyed reminding her of that fact. They enjoyed taking away her dignity, stripping her of any semblance of control. She pushed herself back further into the corner of the room, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The tall officer advanced on her, a sadistic gleam in his eyes. "You know," he said slowly, as though savoring every word, "it's a real pleasure for us to deal with people like you." Layla's blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, to push back, but the words wouldn't come. They were closing in, their hands outstretched, and there was nowhere to go. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to fight, but her mind went blank, paralyzed by the sheer horror of the moment. She had never felt so powerless. But just as the officer reached for her, a loud honking noise from outside startled her. It was followed by the screech of tires as a car abruptly stopped in front of the building. Layla's heart raced as the officers froze, their heads turning in unison toward the window. A sharp voice echoed from outside, calling her name. "Layla. Are you all right?" It was Aaron. Layla's husband. He had come home. The officers' faces shifted, panic flashing in their eyes. They looked at each other as if debating their next move. And then, in a blur of motion, they darted for the window, scrambling to escape through it as though their lives depended on it. The sudden rush of freedom left Layla frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened. She felt weak, her legs shaking beneath her as she slowly sank to the floor. Her mind couldn't quite catch up to the whirlwind of events. Aaron rushed into the apartment, his face a mask of concern as he knelt beside her. His arms enveloped her in a protective embrace, his touch grounding her. He whispered her name, over and over again, as though making sure she was real, that she was safe. But Layla knew that she wasn't safe. Not really. This was only the beginning. The cost of Aaron's political ambitions had just come crashing down on her, and she had no idea what it would take to survive what was to come. As the weight of the night's events settled on her, Layla couldn't help but wonder, was this the price of being married to someone who sought to change the world? Would her life, her very identity, be consumed by the shadows of power, corruption, and the price of ambition? The price of ambition. Layla sat on the couch, her fingers trembling as they fumbled with the hem of her blouse. Aaron was pacing again, moving from one end of the room to the other, his brow furrowed with concern. The last few hours had been a blur, she had barely processed what had happened. She hadn't spoken much since Aaron arrived, her thoughts tangled in a haze of disbelief, anger, and confusion. She watched him, her heart aching as he raked a hand through his salt and pepper hair. He was trying to hold it together, trying to focus, but she could see the strain in his eyes. She could feel it too, the weight of the world pressing down on both of them. Aaron stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression softening as he looked at her for the first time since entering the apartment. "Layla," he said quietly, his voice laced with concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" I've never seen you so shaken." She shook her head, unable to fully form the words. I don't know what to think, Aaron. I keep asking myself why this happened. Who were they? What do they want from us?" Aaron's face hardened, his jaw clenching in anger. "They're trying to intimidate us. Trying to send a message. But it's not just me they're targeting. It's you, too." He moved to sit beside her, his hand reaching for hers. "I told you this wouldn't be easy. When I decided to run for mayor, I knew we'd face opposition. But I never imagined it would escalate like this." Layla's eyes filled with tears, though she hadn't realized she was crying. She wiped them away quickly, but the feeling of helplessness lingered. "Is this really the price of your ambition?" she whispered. "Is this what it means to be your wife? To live in constant fear? To have strangers come into my home and tear it apart without reason?" Aaron took a deep breath, his eyes softening as he squeezed her hand. "I never wanted this for you. I wanted us to have a life, to build something together. But the moment I stepped into this race, I knew it wouldn't just be about me anymore. It would be about everything we've worked for. But that doesn't mean it's fair. That doesn't mean it's right. Layla bit her lip, trying to hold back the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She wanted to be strong for him, for both of them, but this was too much. She had always known that being married to a man in politics came with its challenges. She had always understood that the spotlight would shine brighter on them both as Aaron's campaign grew. But she never expected this kind of personal assault, this level of threat to their lives, to their home. "I'm scared, Aaron," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how much more I can take." Aaron pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said firmly, his voice filled with determination. "I swear to you, I'll protect you from anyone who tries to hurt you. We're in this together, and we'll face whatever comes." But even as he spoke the words, Layla couldn't shake the feeling that they were already in too deep. Aaron's political ambitions had already drawn the attention of powerful people, people who wouldn't hesitate to use whatever means necessary to undermine him. And now, it seemed, they were using her as leverage. The idea of being targeted in this way, of having her life turned upside down by forces she couldn't even see, was terrifying. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear the harsh sound of the officers tearing through her home, the words they had spoken to her, words she couldn't forget, words that made her feel less than human. A sharp knock on the door startled them both, and Layla flinched. Aaron immediately stood up, his hand instinctively moving toward the phone on the table, but he hesitated. After a long moment, he walked toward the door, his body tense, his eyes narrowing as he peered through the peephole. A voice came from the other side. "Mr. Davis? I need to speak with you." Aaron turned to Layla, his expression unreadable. He motioned for her to stay where she was, then opened the door cautiously. A man in a dark suit stood on the other side, his face a mask of professionalism. He had a sharp, almost calculating look to him, the kind of person who was used to getting what he wanted. "I'm Detective Johnson," the man said smoothly, extending his hand. "We need to talk about the events from earlier tonight." Aaron didn't immediately shake his hand. Instead, he stepped aside to allow the man to enter, his eyes darting to Layla before closing the door behind him. Layla watched the interaction closely, her heart thumping in her chest. She didn't know whether to be relieved or more nervous. The detective's presence made the situation feel even more real, like they were now part of something bigger than just a random attack. As Detective Johnson walked into the living room, he took a moment to observe the disarray that still lingered. He looked at Layla, his eyes scanning her with a mixture of sympathy and something more calculating. She couldn't tell if he was trying to make her feel at ease or if he was studying her every movement. "Mr. Davis," the detective began, his voice calm, though the tension in the air was palpable. "I'm sure you're both aware that the situation earlier tonight is not something we take lightly. The officers involved have already been questioned, but I need to make something clear. There are certain people, powerful people, who are not happy about your candidacy. You've made enemies, and this is only the beginning. They are not just going after you. They're going after everything you love." Layla felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine as the detective's words sunk in. She had known, deep down, that this wasn't just about the police raid. But hearing it confirmed, hearing someone who clearly had knowledge of the darker side of politics say it out loud, made the situation feel all the more real. The forces that were coming after them were far from ordinary. Aaron's expression darkened. "So, this wasn't just a random act?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "No, sir," Detective Johnson replied, his eyes narrowing. "It was deliberate. The message they're trying to send is clear. They'll stop at nothing to take you down. And they'll use anyone and anything to get to you, your wife included." Layla's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Aaron, her heart heavy with fear. She had known that being in the public eye would come with risks, but this was more than she had ever anticipated. She had always tried to stay out of the limelight, to support her husband quietly, but now her world felt like it was spinning out of control. Detective Johnson leaned forward, his tone becoming more urgent. "This is a warning, Mr. Davis. If you continue with your campaign, if you push forward with your ambition, you need to understand that your wife will be in constant danger. You need to think about what this means for her. The people you're going up against will use any means necessary to break you. They'll break her too." Aaron's jaw clenched, his fists tightening as he listened to the detective's chilling words. Layla felt her heart race, but she refused to back down. She couldn't let fear dictate her life, not now, not when everything she had fought for with Aaron was so close to becoming a reality. "I won't back down," Aaron said firmly, his eyes never leaving the detective. "This is bigger than me. It's about what's right for this city, for the people. I'll protect Layla, but I'm not going to let them scare me into quitting. I won't let them win." The detective gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "That's your decision, Mr. Davis. But know that the stakes are higher than you realize. And the consequences may not be something you can come back from." As the detective left, the weight of his words lingered in the room, heavy and oppressive. Layla knew their lives had changed forever. They weren't just fighting for Aaron's political future anymore, they were fighting for their very survival. Shadows of the past. The days that followed the break-in felt like a slow descent into uncertainty. Layla couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just out of reach, like a storm cloud hovering above them, threatening to rain down at any moment. Despite Aaron's promises to protect her, despite the assurances from Detective Johnson, Layla knew the battle was far from over. If anything, it had just begun. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face on the street, every flicker of movement in the corner of her eye made her heart race. She couldn't help but feel like a target. For the first time in years, she found herself looking over her shoulder, second-guessing every decision, every action. The quiet, predictable life she had once known had crumbled, replaced by a constant undercurrent of fear and tension. Aaron tried to remain optimistic, as always, but Layla could see the toll it was taking on him. The weight of his campaign was heavy enough without all the outside interference. But now, as the threats grew more tangible, Layla couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could hold on. How long could they keep fighting before it all came crashing down? She sat at the kitchen table, the soft glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds, casting a warm light on the room. But even the comforting warmth of the sun couldn't chase away the coldness that had settled in her chest. She tried to focus on the task in front of her, sorting through emails, responding to messages, doing anything to distract herself from the creeping anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. But then the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence, pulling Layla from her thoughts. She reached for it, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up the receiver. Her heart skipped a beat when she heard the voice on the other end. "Layla?" It was Aaron. But there was something in his voice that made her stomach drop, an edge of urgency, of fear. "Aaron? What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tight. "I need you to stay calm," he said, his words measured, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. "I just got off the phone with the campaign manager. There's been a situation. We need to meet. It's urgent." Layla's mind raced. What could it possibly be? Another threat? A new danger? "What's going on?" she pressed, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "There's no time to explain right now," Aaron said. "Just, please, stay inside, lock the doors, and don't let anyone in unless it's me. I'll be there soon." The call ended abruptly. Layla stared at the phone in her hand, her mind whirling with unanswered questions. She had never heard Aaron sound like that before, so strained, so desperate. Whatever was happening, it was big. And she had a sinking feeling it had to do with the people who had been targeting them. Without thinking, she bolted to the door, locking it behind her. The sound of the bolt sliding into place was oddly reassuring, but it didn't ease the knot of fear tightening in her chest. She moved to the window, peering out into the street, half expecting to see someone watching her. But the street was quiet, empty, just as it always was in the middle of the day. Time seemed to drag on. Layla paced the living room, her mind racing with possible scenarios. What if this was the beginning of something worse? What if Aaron was in danger? What if they had finally come for him, for both of them? The sound of tires screeching to a halt outside interrupted her thoughts. Layla's heart leaped into her throat as she rushed to the window once more, but this time, she saw Aaron's car pulling up to the curb. Relief washed over her in waves, though it was tinged with a sharp sense of dread. She opened the door just as Aaron stepped onto the porch, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he took her hands in his grip tight, almost desperate. "Layla, we need to go. Now," he said, his voice low and urgent. Layla blinked, confused. "What's going on, Aaron? What's happening?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, scanning the street behind him, his eyes flicking from side to side as though expecting something, or someone, at any moment. "Someone's been following me," he said finally, his voice grim. "They know what we're doing, and they're making it clear they'll stop at nothing to destroy everything we've built." Layla's breath caught in her throat. She had feared this moment, but hearing it aloud, from Aaron's lips, made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Who are they?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Aaron hesitated before answering. "People with power. People who don't want change. People who'll do anything to keep their grip on this city." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping protectively around her. "Listen to me. I've made some arrangements. We need to leave, Layla. They know where we live. They've already made their move once. We can't stay here anymore." Layla stared at him, the reality of their situation crashing down on her. They were no longer just a couple, no longer just a family trying to build a future. They were targets. And she was right in the middle of it. "I don't understand," she whispered, her mind struggling to catch up. "We can't just leave. What about the campaign? What about everything?" Aaron's face hardened. "I'll take care of the campaign. I'll deal with the fallout. Right now, the only thing that matters is keeping you safe." Layla opened her mouth to protest, but Aaron's eyes silenced her. There was a finality to his words, an undeniable weight to them. He was already making plans, already taking control of the situation in a way she couldn't have anticipated. "We're not safe here anymore, Layla," Aaron continued. "Not as long as we stay in the public eye. We've got to go into hiding, at least for now. The campaign, everything, it's secondary. Right now, it's just us." As he spoke, Layla felt her chest tighten, her breath shallow. A strange mixture of fear and relief washed over her. She had known something like this might come, but she had never expected it to unfold so quickly, so violently. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Aaron's gaze flickered to the door, then back to her. "I've already made arrangements. A safe house. We'll leave tonight. No one can know where we're going." Layla nodded numbly, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. There was no going back. They had crossed a line, and now they had to live with the consequences. But one thing was certain, they couldn't stay here. Not anymore. As the sun began to set, the shadows growing longer, Layla felt the tension in her body start to loosen. It was no longer about survival for the sake of survival, it was about survival for the sake of love, for the sake of the future they had dreamed of together. But she couldn't shake the thought that this was only the beginning. Their lives would never be the same again. They were in a war now, a war they couldn't avoid. And the worst part was, they didn't even know who their enemies were. The weight of secrets. That night, as the city skyline blurred in the rearview mirror, Layla couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of what was happening. The hum of the car engine filled the silence between her and Aaron, but it couldn't drown out the thoughts swirling in her head. They were leaving everything behind, their home, their lives, their future. She had always known that being with Aaron would come with sacrifices, that his work in politics would require them to make difficult choices, but she had never imagined it would come to this. As they drove through unfamiliar streets, Aaron's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white from the tension. Layla glanced at him occasionally, but he remained silent, his face set in grim determination. She wanted to ask him more, wanted to know why they had to leave so suddenly, why they couldn't just fight back, why they couldn't confront their enemies head-on. But every time she opened her mouth, the words died on her tongue. She knew the answer. They weren't just fighting a political battle anymore. They were fighting for their lives. Aaron had told her about the people after them, the powerful forces who had never wanted to see him in office. But the more Layla thought about it, the more she wondered what exactly those people wanted from them. What had they done to deserve such ruthless attention? And who were these enemies who could wield so much power? She glanced out the window, the lights of the city fading behind them as they drove farther into the countryside. It felt surreal, like they were disappearing from the world. "Where are we going?" Layla finally asked, her voice barely audible. Aaron's eyes flickered to her for a brief moment, but he kept his focus on the road. "A safe house. It's a secure location, one that only a few people know about. I've been working on this for months. If we stay at the apartment, we're too exposed." "I don't understand," Layla murmured. "Why did it have to come to this? We've done nothing wrong. I haven't even seen these people, and they're coming after us." Aaron sighed, his grip on the wheel tightening even more. "It's not about what we've done. It's about what we represent. My campaign has threatened their control over this city. They've got money, influence, power. They don't want things to change. But why you? Why us?" "You're asking the wrong questions, Layla," Aaron said, his voice strained. "They've always been here. The people in power who think they can do whatever they want. They've been running things for years, controlling everything behind the scenes. My campaign, my run for mayor, has upset that balance. They'll do anything to stop it. And they'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Layla stared at him, her mind racing. She had known, on some level, that Aaron's campaign was a threat to the established order. But it had never felt real until now. The conspiracy, the manipulation, it was all too much to process. "We can't run forever," she said, her voice cracking with the weight of the truth. "We can't just hide away in a safe house. Eventually, they'll find us." Aaron was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving the road. "I don't know what happens next, Layla. I don't know how long we can stay hidden, but I do know that we can't fight them without being prepared. We need to regroup, get our heads straight, and figure out how to beat them." Layla nodded slowly, even though the uncertainty of their situation gnawed at her. She felt helpless. She didn't know what the future held, and that was a terrifying thought. But the one thing she did know was that she couldn't back down. Not now. After what seemed like hours of driving, the city lights completely faded, and the dark, quiet roads stretched out before them. They finally arrived at a small, secluded house, nestled in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the city. The area was quiet, almost too quiet, and Layla couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as she stepped out of the car. The house loomed before her, dark, isolated, but strangely comforting in its seclusion. It was a safe haven for now, but it was also a constant reminder of everything they had left behind. Aaron helped her gather their things, and they made their way inside. The air inside the house was musty, but the warmth from the fireplace offered a small amount of comfort. Layla set her bag down by the door and looked around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. This wasn't home. It wasn't even close. But for the time being, it would have to do. Aaron set down his things and began checking the locks on the doors and windows. "We'll be safe here for a while," he said, his voice distant. "But we can't stay too long. This place won't be enough forever." Layla nodded, her thoughts swirling. She was too exhausted to process everything. The tension in the air felt thick, suffocating. She wanted to feel safe, wanted to believe that they were doing the right thing by hiding, but every moment that passed only added to the weight on her shoulders. "Do you think it will ever end?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Aaron paused, his back to her as he checked the security system. He didn't answer at first. He was avoiding the question, Layla could feel it. But after a moment, he turned to face her, his expression softer than before. "I don't know, Layla. But I do know this, we've always been fighters. And we're not going to give up now. We'll figure this out together." Layla looked at him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude, but also with fear. She had never felt more unsure of the future. Everything they had worked for, everything they had planned, seemed to be slipping away. The world outside their small house was still. There was no sound but the crackling of the fire. But Layla knew that the silence was deceptive. Somewhere, out there, their enemies were watching, waiting. The fight for their future wasn't over. It had just shifted into the shadows. The days that followed were a blur of strange quiet and unsettling tension. Aaron spent most of his time on the phone, speaking with allies from the campaign, organizing the few people he could trust. Layla, on the other hand, spent her days alone in the house, trying to make sense of the chaos around her. She had never been someone who sat idle for long, but the isolation was starting to get to her. It felt like they were living in limbo, like everything they had built was slowly being destroyed. And then, one evening, Layla found herself staring at the phone in her hand, a single message blinking at her from the screen. The message was brief, but it was enough to make her heart stop. It was from an unknown number. "We know where you are. We will come for you. No place is safe." The words sent a chill down her spine. They weren't just trying to intimidate them, they were sending a clear warning. No matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, they would never truly be free of the danger that pursued them. Layla took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, that they were running out of time. The enemy was closer than they thought, and they were running out of options. The tipping point. The days were growing shorter, but the night seemed to stretch on forever in the small cabin. Layla had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without the weight of constant anxiety pressing on her chest. Every sound outside, every creak in the old wood, every rustle in the trees, felt like a warning. The quiet had become an oppressive silence, where the very air seemed to carry threats. Aaron had grown more focused, more determined. He spent most of his time organizing, reaching out to his most trusted allies from the campaign, piecing together what little information they had. The more they uncovered, the more Layla realized just how deep the conspiracy ran. It wasn't just a few corrupt individuals in the city, it was a network of powerful figures, people who had infiltrated every aspect of their lives, and the system. Despite Aaron's efforts to stay on top of it all, Layla could see that the toll was wearing him down. He was hardly sleeping, his face etched with exhaustion, and every phone call seemed to add another layer of stress to his already heavy burden. But what troubled her most was the sense of isolation that was growing between them. Even though they were together, in the same space, she could feel the distance widening, a gulf created by the overwhelming pressure of their situation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, Layla sat on the porch, watching the shadows stretch across the yard. She'd been trying to make sense of everything, to calm the storm of fear and uncertainty inside her. But it was impossible. They were being hunted, there was no denying that. And it wasn't just a matter of keeping out of sight. It was a matter of survival. Aaron joined her on the porch after a while, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat beside her, his eyes lost in the distance as the last light of the day disappeared. For a moment, they sat in silence, both of them knowing that there were no easy answers to the questions they were asking. No simple path forward. "I've been thinking," Layla said quietly, breaking the silence. "Maybe we should just leave. Disappear completely. There's no reason for us to keep fighting if we can't win." Aaron turned his head to look at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Layla felt a pang in her chest. She knew that part of him was exhausted, as tired of running as she was. But there was something deeper in him, something that refused to surrender. "We can't just run away, Layla," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "We've come too far for that. If we back down now, we let them win. We let them tear down everything we've built, everything we've worked for. And I won't let that happen. Not without a fight." Layla wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that they couldn't keep living like this, that they couldn't keep putting themselves at risk. But she saw the look in his eyes. The same determination that had driven him to run for mayor in the first place. It was the fire that had always burned inside him, the same fire that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago. "I know you don't want to hear this," she said quietly, "but I'm scared. I'm scared of what they'll do to us. To you. To me." Aaron took her hand, his grip tight but gentle. "I know you are. And I'm scared too. But this isn't just about me, Layla. It's about all of us. The people who believe in change, in what we stand for. If we run, if we let them push us out, we're giving up on everything we've been fighting for. And I won't let that happen." There was a quiet strength in his voice, a resolve that Layla couldn't ignore. She had always known that Aaron was a fighter. But hearing him speak like this, with such determination, filled her with both pride and fear. She couldn't lose him. Not like this. But she also knew that he couldn't fight alone. They needed each other more than ever. "We'll do it together, right?" Layla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aaron nodded. "Together. We fight, or we fall." As the night fell around them, the cabin grew darker, the shadows deepening. Layla leaned into Aaron, her head resting on his shoulder, her heart still heavy with the weight of the uncertainty that hung over them. But in that moment, as they sat together in the quiet of the night, something shifted. A decision had been made. They weren't going to run. Not anymore. The next morning, Aaron was up before dawn, his mind already working, planning their next steps. Layla joined him in the kitchen, her thoughts still lingering on the conversation from the night before. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, that they were running out of time. "We need to get ahead of them," Aaron said as he sipped his coffee, his gaze focused on the map they had spread out on the table. "They're watching every move we make. We have to take the initiative." Layla watched him, a sense of resolve settling over her. She had always known that Aaron was strong, but now she saw just how far he was willing to go. The man who had once been her partner in dreams was now a man on a mission, determined to take down the very forces that sought to destroy everything they had worked for. "We can't trust anyone, Aaron," she said, her voice serious. "The people we've been relying on, they're not safe. They've been compromised." Aaron paused, looking at her with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "You're right. We have to trust ourselves now. We'll make the decisions. We'll fight for what we believe in, no matter what it costs." The days that followed were filled with frantic activity. Aaron reached out to his inner circle, those few individuals who still stood by him, even in the face of danger. Layla helped organize their efforts, moving cautiously behind the scenes to gather the information they needed. The conspiracy they were fighting against was more complicated than they had initially realized, far-reaching, woven into every facet of the city's infrastructure, from the police force to the highest offices in government. Every step forward felt like a victory, but also a step closer to danger. They could feel the pressure building, the walls closing in around them. And with every piece of information they uncovered, Layla couldn't help but feel the rising dread that they might be in over their heads. One afternoon, as they were meeting with one of their allies in a quiet cafe far from the cabin, Aaron received a call that made his blood run cold. He listened for a moment, his face going pale. Then he hung up, his hands shaking slightly as he placed the phone down on the table. "It's starting," he said quietly, his voice strained. "They know we're about to make our move. They're coming for us." Layla's heart sank as the words hit her like a ton of bricks. There was no more time for planning. No more time for strategy. Their enemies were already mobilizing. The battle had begun, and they were caught right in the middle of it. "Then we fight," Layla said, her voice steady. "We fight with everything we have." Breaking point. Days bled into each other in the isolated cabin. Layla had grown accustomed to the quiet, but the silence was heavy, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Every morning, she would wake up to the same routine, Aaron already up, checking the security system, getting updates from trusted sources. They both knew the stakes. They both knew they were running out of time. The message she had received days earlier still haunted her. "We know where you are. We will come for you. No place is safe." It had been enough to make her stomach turn. The fact that their enemies had found them, that they were being hunted with such precision, made every moment feel like it could be their last. It wasn't just the fear of being found, it was the overwhelming sense that they were powerless in this fight, that no matter how hard they tried, they were always 2 steps behind. Aaron had insisted on keeping up with the campaign, continuing to push forward with plans from the shadows. But Layla had begun to notice the strain on him, the toll the pressure was taking. He had always been a man of action, a man who could deal with adversity, but this was different. Every time he picked up the phone, every time he spoke with an ally, it was like he was holding his breath, waiting for the next blow to land. Layla watched him closely, her concern growing each day. She could see the dark circles under his eyes, the exhaustion that was etched into his features. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating. He was too focused on the campaign and the looming threats that surrounded them. "Are you eating enough?" she asked one evening as she prepared dinner. She tried to keep her tone light, but there was an edge to it, an urgency. Aaron didn't look up from his phone as he read a message. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. "You don't look fine," Layla said, her voice soft but insistent. She set down the knife in her hand, walking over to him. "I know you're worried, but you can't keep going like this. We can't keep living like this." Aaron sighed, his eyes closing as if the weight of the world had just landed on his shoulders. "I don't have a choice, Layla. If we stop, it's over. They'll win. We'll lose everything." Layla's heart ached as she watched him. He was right, in a way. If they gave up now, if they let the fear consume them, everything they had worked for would crumble. But she also knew that they couldn't keep running. The tension, the constant fear, was eating away at them both. Something had to change. "We can't live in hiding forever," she said quietly, her words lingering in the room like a quiet storm. "We can't keep running from them. Sooner or later, they'll find us again." Aaron's eyes shot up to meet hers. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to stop hiding," she replied firmly. "We need to fight back. There was a long silence between them. Aaron stared at her, the storm of emotions in his eyes. He looked exhausted, torn between the man he had been, strong, determined, and hopeful, and the man he was becoming, drained, paranoid, and desperate. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "But I don't know how. The people after us, they don't play by any rules. They're too powerful. What if we can't win? What if we're putting ourselves and everyone we care about at risk?" Layla sat down beside him, her hand gently resting on his. "We don't know what will happen. But we can't keep living like this. Fear can't rule us. I know the risks, Aaron. But we need to take action before they take everything from us." Aaron ran a hand through his hair, frustration clouding his face. "I've been trying to protect you," he said softly, almost to himself. "But maybe I've been protecting you from the wrong things." Layla shook her head, squeezing his hand. "You can't protect me by hiding forever. We need to make them see us. We need to show them that we're not afraid. That we won't let them tear us down." For a moment, there was only silence between them, the weight of their unspoken thoughts hanging heavily in the air. Finally, Aaron nodded, though the uncertainty in his eyes didn't completely fade. "Okay," he said, his voice steady but edged with doubt. "We'll fight. But we have to do it smartly. We have to know who we're dealing with, what their next move will be. If we're going to take them down, we need more than just guts, we need strategy. We need the right people in our corner." And so, they began to plan. The following weeks were filled with late-night discussions, carefully laid out strategies, and a relentless focus on reclaiming their future. They reached out to trusted allies, people Aaron had worked with in the past who had remained loyal, even after his political rise. They knew they couldn't do this alone. They needed to gather information, to understand who was behind the attacks, and what resources they could muster to fight back. But as the days passed, it became clear that their enemies were always one step ahead. Every time they made a move, their opposition seemed to counter it effortlessly. Layla began to realize just how deep the corruption ran, how far-reaching the people who were after them truly were. One night, as they sat in front of a map laid out on the table, Aaron's phone buzzed. He picked it up quickly, his face pale as he read the message. "Layla," he whispered, his voice shaking, "they know. They know we're planning something." A cold dread washed over her as she looked at him. "How?" "They've been monitoring everything. Every call, every email. It's all part of their game." Aaron's voice was barely audible. "They've been watching us the whole time." A knock on the door shattered the moment of silence, sending a shockwave of fear through Layla's body. She and Aaron exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. Whoever it wasn't good. Aaron stood and moved toward the door cautiously, his hand on the handle. Layla held her breath, waiting for whatever was about to come. The door creaked open, but it wasn't an enemy agent standing on the other side. It was a man they hadn't seen in years, a man who had once been Aaron's closest ally, a confidant. But now, as he stepped into the room, Layla could see the wear and tear on his face. He was gaunt, his eyes hollow with the knowledge of what he had done. "Leo?" Aaron's voice was tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Leo's eyes darted nervously to the door behind him, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I've got information. Information that can help you." Layla's stomach tightened. She didn't trust him, not after everything that had happened. But she could see the fear in his eyes, the desperation. "Then tell us everything," Aaron said, his tone hard, determined. "We're running out of time." Leo stepped inside, his back to the door, and the weight of his words was heavy. "They're on to you. They've been on to you for months. And now, they've decided it's time to finish what they started. Layla's heart skipped a beat. Who's they? She demanded, her voice thick with tension. Who are we really up against? Leo's gaze met hers, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then he spoke, his voice shaking. The ones who've controlled this city for decades. The ones who don't care who gets hurt, as long as they get what they want. They're everywhere, Layla. And they will stop at nothing to make sure you never make it to the mayor's office. Aaron's hands clenched into fists. Then we'll take them down. All of them. Leo nodded gravely. But be careful. These people? They've already set their trap. And now, you're walking right into it. The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of danger. Layla didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear, there was no turning back. They were in the fight of their lives now, and the stakes had never been higher. Aaron nodded, his gaze hardening. Yes. We fight.